If you've been following along in my videos, you know that I really love the GFX system. I've been doing photography since 2008, on and off. My first set of cameras that I've used were all Canon. My first true kit that I purchased myself was on the XF system. Ever since 2021, when I started making videos on the GFX 100S and various lenses, I was truly hooked. To me, the GFX 100 is the top of the line quality, and once you use it, it's really hard to go back to anything else. In this video, I'm happy to announce that I've completed my GFX kit. It really only took about 2 years for me to figure out which lenses I want, but I'm really happy with all the lens selections, at least at this moment, and I'm gonna call it complete. Complete in kind of like a home gym kind of way, where you say it's complete, but it's actually never complete and it keeps evolving as you go. For real though, there aren't any lenses at this moment that really spark my interest or that I really want to try. Aside from the tilt shift lenses, let's hope that I don't love them when I try them because they're really expensive. So in this video, I just want to run through all the lenses that make up my kit and discuss the reasoning, why I bought them, what I love about them, and of course show you some sample images, some of my favorite images from each of the lenses. So let's jump into it. And first up, we have the GFX 110. But officially it is the GF 110mm f2 RLM-WR lens. This lens has an 87mm equivalent, has a 77mm thread size, has a 3-foot minimum focal distance, weighs in at 2.22 pounds, and has an MSRP of $2,800. So why did I pick this up? Obviously, this is a phenomenal lens. This is a lens that you would buy into the system for. When I was initially doing my GFX research, combing the internet for reviews and Facebook groups and all of that, it wasn't long before I found people praising this lens, and obviously the praise held up. It is surprising though, I don't have a dedicated review on this lens, so I'm gonna add that to the list at some point. This was the lens that I first purchased for the GFX system, and I regret nothing. So why is this lens good? Well, it is just a really magical lens with great bokeh. At f2, which if you multiply it by the crop factor, you get about f1.6, which isn't anything crazy shallow or ridiculous, but it's just a really magical lens and the results are amazing. It's insanely sharp, it's basically clinical, which is something that some people don't like, meaning the lens is just too perfect, but for me, I find that something that's very attractive. So what is this lens good for? Well, it's a great street lens. It's a little heavy, but it's still a great street lens. It's great for portraits in the studio, or really anything in the studio. Nature, literally anything you want to shoot, this lens can work well for. So what's bad about this lens? Nothing. No, just kidding. If you want to nitpick, you could probably talk about the weight of this lens. It is really heavy. If you are traveling around doing street photography and you have a few lenses in your bag, like 3 GFX lenses, and this is one of them, you're probably going to hate your life. It's definitely a really heavy lens. And if you want to talk about one other thing to nitpick, I could say the minimum focal distance. Although it is a pretty telephoto lens at 85mm, it's to be expected really. So what are the surprises with this lens? I've heard amazing things about this lens before I used it, and once Fuji sent it to me to test out, I was absolutely blown away. And honestly, every time I continue to use this lens, it still feels pretty magical. I really enjoy using it every time I get to use it. So to buy or not, obviously 100% buy this lens. I don't think you could ever regret buying this lens. It is phenomenal. And for the rating, I would give it a 10 out of 10. It's obviously a perfect lens, at least in my opinion. And up next, we have a lens that I don't actually have here. If you can just imagine it, it is the GF 120mm macro RLM OIS-WR lens. It's a mouthful. It's a 95mm equivalent, has a 62mm thread size, which is kind of small, an aperture of f4 to f32. It weighs in at 2.16 pounds, which honestly, it feels a lot lighter than the 110, but I guess it's actually pretty much the same weight. The minimum focal distance is about 1.5 feet, and the MSRP is $2,700. Why did I pick this up? Well, it's no secret that GFX glass is really heavy and rather large. I just wanted a lens that could live at the studio, that I wouldn't have to worry about. Remember, I'm in New York City. I take the subway to my studio, so I'm not just throwing a backpack in a car. That's why I purchased this lens. Why is this lens good? It's insanely sharp. The quality is absolutely amazing. It has a fair minimum focal distance at 1.5 feet. I'd say it's a little large, but you know, it's half of that of the 110, and it's obviously less shallow than the 110. So what is this lens good for? Obviously studio work, and of course macro work. It's not a true macro lens, being 0.5 magnification, but it's really the best we have on the GFX system, at least for now, until Fuji comes out with a different lens that makes me want to add it to my kit. Also, this lens has pretty fast autofocus. I did a shoot with my dogs in the studio. I think this is back in my first video I ever put out, and I used both the 110 and the 120. This lens has drastically better autofocus than the 110. So what's bad about this lens? Well, being an f4, you will obviously need some bright lights for subjects in motion. For most studio shoots, you'll probably need a tripod, but it also depends what you're trying to do. I used this lens back in that first video, doing some macro flower shots at the Botanic Gardens. And to be honest, I really wasn't able to get close enough, in my opinion. The large 1.5 feet minimum focal distance definitely puts a little bit of a damper in using this lens for the street purposes, at least in my opinion. So what are the surprises? On the XF system, my studio lens was the XF 80mm. Actually, I have it right here. This phenomenal lens right here, the XF 80. I would say this is a better lens than the 120, but sorry, GFX. They don't make this end adapter for this lens. For street photography, I was kind of surprised that I didn't like this lens that much. Maybe it's just me and my style of shooting, but this lens is not really one I would bring onto the streets. So to buy the 120 or not, well, I think it really depends on your needs. There's lots of times I'm in the studio and I'm kind of thinking about if I could just use the 110 instead. For smaller objects, you are gonna need to use the 120 since the minimum focal distance is much smaller. You could potentially use macro tubes. There are two available on the GFX, the MCEX 16 or 45G. And I can tell you the 45G is definitely kind of hard to use. It's not the same thing as just using a lens on its own. It's kind of its own beast and it has its own learning curve and all of that. Maybe the 16 is a bit better. Maybe in the future I'll make a video on that, but I'll have to report back on that. At this moment in time, I don't regret the lens purchase. It lives in my studio, it's fine there. I've said that 5,000 times. So to buy or not depends on what you need. So I'll give this lens an 8 out of 10. It's a really solid lens. It doesn't blow me away, but I think if you need macro, you need minimum focal distance, this is your lens. I always enjoy using this lens for product work. Before we get to the next lens, I want to take a second and tell you about this video sponsor, Manfrotto. As a professional photographer or camera enthusiast, you already know about this brand, or at the very least, you've heard of them. Manfrotto makes a bunch of camera gear ranging from backpacks to tripods, lighting stands to backdrops, and much more. But today, I want to talk about tripod heads. You know, these things. Since I got serious about studio photography in 2018, the tripod head of my choice has always been Manfrotto. At my studio, my go-to is the Manfrotto 410 geared tripod head. I really love this tripod head because it has 3 knobs that let you do micro adjustments and get your framing absolutely perfect. On the street, anytime I'm doing serious work, no matter the tripod legs, I always screw on my Manfrotto X Pro ball head. Even when using my GFX with my 110 lens, I never get any micro shakes. All photos are super sharp with this tripod head, and it really never lets me down. And from behind the scenes of my YouTube videos, my go-to tripod head is a Manfrotto X Pro fluid head. For video, I like a fluid head so you can adjust the camera position in a smooth fashion, unlike a photo ball head where you release it and the camera moves around a lot. The video fluid head just makes it really nice and easy to adjust. If you are in the market for any tripod heads or even a full tripod, check out Manfrotto. I'll throw some links in the description below. And with that being said, let's get to the next lens. So up next, we have a bit of a bonus entry because this lens is no longer in my kit. But nevertheless, we have the GF 50mm f3.5 RLM WR lens. So this little guy is a 40mm equivalent, has a 62mm filter thread size. Its aperture is obviously 3.5 to f32. It weighs in at about 12 ounces and is a pretty large minimum focal distance of about 2 feet. And the MSRP is $1,000. So why did I buy this lens? Well, it was the third purchase for my system, and I bought this lens shortly after purchasing my GFX 100S. When I purchased my camera, there already was an announcement long ago for the GF 55mm 1.7 for a future release. So I went with this lens, skipping the GF 45 2.8, with the plans of obviously owning the GF 55. And I justified owning both the GF 55 and the GF 50 since the pancake would be an easy to carry around lens. So the good about this lens, well, happy to report that you can actually connect this to your camera and it lets you take pictures. So that's about it. Okay, just kidding. But obviously this is a pretty solid lens. It is the smallest lens on the GFX system. What's cool about this lens is it has a lens cap, if it wants to focus. It has a lens cap and a hood combined. So you can just use this. You don't actually really need a filter, but it lets you kind of have a lens hood while protecting your lens at the same time. So it's pretty solid feature in my opinion. So what is this lens good for? Well, street photography and pretty much any photography in general. It's a 40mm equivalent, so it's pretty versatile. And the bad for this lens, and this might ruffle some feathers here. Obviously, I owned about 3 lenses for the first year that I had the GFX. The 120 lived at the studio, and the 110 and the GF50. So lenses that I would use in the street were pretty much only the 50 and the 110 unless I was borrowing something from Fuji. And to be honest with you, 99.9 times out of 100, I would use the GF 110. I find the 50 to be a very vanilla lens. Again, depends on your style of shooting. The bokeh is not great. The background separation, depending on the situation, is pretty negligible, basically an f4. And this lens does flare pretty heavily compared to most GFX lenses, and the flaring is not very good looking in my opinion. This lens just really doesn't do it for me, and I know that's not the case for everyone. Some people really love this lens, but it's just not the case with me. If we take into account all the lenses that I've ever purchased, all the lenses on the XF system and the GFX system, there's only one lens that I regret buying, and it's the GF50. When I got my hands first on the GF55, it really solidified my decision to sell this lens. Surprises that I had with this lens, well, I was surprised that GF glass kind of disappointed me. But it's not to say all GF glass is perfect, so this one just wasn't for me. To buy this lens or not, well, pains me to say this, but in my opinion, I would not buy this lens. I know I'm gonna get some hate for this. This lens just didn't do it for me. So that being said, I am gonna be giving this lens away once I reach 100,000 subs. Just kidding, that's not happening on 2 levels, if you know what I'm saying. I would have put this lens last as it's not really in my kit anymore, but I wanted to end this video on a pretty positive note. So my rating, 5 out of 10, take it with a grain of salt. It just wasn't for me, it might work for you, I'm not really sure. Up next, we have the GF 20 to 35mm f4 RWR lens. This lens is a 16 to 28mm equivalent, has an 82mm filter thread size. It weighs in at 1.6 pounds, has a minimum focal distance of 14 inches, and an MSRP of $2,500 USD. Why did I buy this lens? Well, I love wide street photography. This is the widest lens that Fuji offers on the GF system. Fuji was awesome enough to send me this lens a few times to test out, and every single time I had to send it back, I kind of died inside, so I just had to have it. Why is this lens good? Well, I've made like 500 videos on this lens. I'll try to keep this short, but this is a killer lens. Despite how much I dislike f4 lenses, this lens is amazing. The distortion is reasonable at 20mm. It's crazy sharp edge to edge. And this lens is actually pretty light for GF glass. And I know this isn't an ultra wide lens at 16mm, but this lens is flat on the front and accepts a normal filter. So that's pretty cool. And 82mm is a very standard filter thread size. I would say that most people purchase their ND filters at, so you don't need to step up or anything, you just screw it right on. Or magnets if you're into the new stuff. It's really interesting what Fuji did with this lens. They basically eliminated the GF23 as it comes in $100 cheaper MSRP. It is lighter, it's sharper, it's better all around, and I really can't recommend this lens enough. What is this lens good for? Obviously street photography, long exposure, HDR, that's my jam, and this lens is great for it. Also, the studio. I would definitely recommend shooting this lens in the studio, probably at the more 35mm range. Distortion is very minimal, so I don't think you could go wrong with this lens in the studio. The bad with this lens, you get a little bit of distortion at 20mm, depending on how you use it. It's a wide lens, so there's a whole thing about that. I really don't have anything bad to say about this lens, nor do I have any surprises. It really exceeded my expectation. And buy it or not, if you are in the market for a wide lens, this is your lens. I would highly recommend purchasing it. And for the rating, 10 out of 10. And closing my kit out, we have our latest addition, the GF 55mm f1.7 RWR lens. This is a 44mm equivalent, has an aperture of f1.7 to f22, a filter thread size of 77mm. It weighs in at 1.71 pounds. Minimum focal distance is 1.6 feet. And the MSRP is $2,300. Why? Well, I was really fortunate enough to get my hands on this lens shortly after it was released to test out, and it was really love at first use. I've been waiting to get my hands on this lens ever since 2021 when it was announced, with the hopes of it being amazing. And it feels really, really good to have it exceed pretty much all my expectations. So what's good about this lens? Well, honestly, most things. It's more like the little brother to the 110 than the 80 because it's a pretty perfect lens. It's hyper sharp, has great autofocus, it has phenomenal depth of field and bokeh. I really can't praise this lens enough. In terms of the weight, I'd probably land it right in the middle. It's not super light like the pancake, but it's not also super heavy like the 110. I could walk around with this lens pretty much all day. I would gladly pick it over the GF50 any day of the week. When it comes to quality like this, weight is a secondary concern, at least for me. And what's really fascinating about this lens is with the release, Fuji just basically murdered 3 lenses, the 50, the GF45, and the GF63. What is this lens good for? Honestly, everything. What is this lens bad for? Honestly, I have nothing bad to say at this moment. I have used this lens a decent amount and I love it. I enjoy using it every time. If something comes up, maybe I'll report back in the future. Issues that the 80mm had, fringing, the bad autofocus, this lens fixed all that. So honestly, I have nothing bad to report with this lens. Surprises with this lens, I was really honestly surprised how magical and amazing this lens is. It sounds really cheesy to say, but every time I use this lens, I kind of get the same feeling as if I'm using the 110. It's just a really pleasant experience. It always exceeds my expectations. To buy this lens or not to buy this lens, honestly, 100% buy this lens. If you can utilize the 44mm focal range, this lens is for you. And to rate this lens, 10 out of 10, it's a perfect lens, at least so far. Final thoughts, is my kit perfect? Absolutely not. It's perfect for me. It does what I need it to do, at least right now. I'm hoping that when I do eventually get my hands on a GFX 100 II, I won't be completely blown away and be sad every time I use my 100S, but I guess we're talking about lenses here, so that's a digression. In terms of lenses, there are 2 future lenses that I do have in mind that don't exist yet. So Fuji, if you're listening, don't make these lenses, because if you do, I'm gonna have to spend more money. First up, I would love to see a GF 35mm 1.7. This would be roughly a 27mm equivalent. I really fell in love with this focal length when I was using the XF 18mm 1.4. I'm actually using that lens to record this video. I don't own it yet. I don't have a reason to purchase it, but it is a phenomenal lens and I would love to have an equivalent on the GFX system. And even more so than that, I would love to see a 14mm 1.4 equivalent on the GFX. So that would roughly be an 18mm 1.7. Notice the 1.7 theme. I'm not a lens scientist, so I'm not sure if that's a reasonable request, an 18mm GFX lens. But honestly, if Fuji did make that lens, I can say I would probably buy it immediately, and it would potentially make me sell my GF 20 to 35mm. Although I really love that lens, I could probably see it collecting a lot of dust if Fuji did make that lens. What lenses did you pick in your GFX kit? Or what lens choices do you disagree with me, or do you have any recommendations for me? Let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button if you found this video helpful and subscribe if you are new here. And with that being said, I will catch you in the next video.